The old three-surface building, which stood on the outskirts of the place, was the Messiagnani Hotel. I will pledge this gloomy man as my lord in the name of Mr. Gray, who appears to my son at night. Guests who stayed here for the night always noticed one wonderful detail. There were no mirrors in all the rooms. They said that when the hotel was a place of luxurious balls, and mirrors hung from every skin. Once upon a time, on the eve of the month, one of the guests disappeared without a trace. The room became empty, and a bloody stain appeared on the wall of the mirror. Mr. Gray had not yet arrived, but the news about the event had spread rapidly, and from that moment the shadow of fear was burning. For decades, people have been talking about the evil spirit that has settled in the mirrors of their hotel. Once Mr. Gray bought the hotel, he ordered all the mirrors to be taken away, singing that it was for the benefit of the guests, and those who, having lost more than one night at the hotel, heard about the pitiful speeches one person felt in the night, as if whispering to you, if there was a passage, walk down the corridor to his room. The whisper was thin, like the rustling of dry leaves, and seemed to come from the empty walls. Another woman swore that she saw her reflection in the window glass. Although her back was to the window, the reflection smiled, but not like her, but ominously, almost predatorily. One day, a young journalist, Lena, arrived at the Moonlight Night Hotel. She was writing an article about urban legends and decided to spend the night in the most terrifying place in the city. The locals tried to dissuade her, but curiosity got the better of her. Gray greeted her with a cold smile. His eyes seemed empty, as if they were looking through her. He led her to a room on the 3rd floor, the only one that was free. I would advise you not to linger near the windows at night, he said when he opened the door. The room was simple. A bed, a table, a lamp. Nothing unusual, except for the strange feeling that the walls here were breathing. Lena had begun unpacking and getting ready for the night when she noticed an old crack in the floor. It ran from the corner of the room and headed towards the middle of the wall, where a mirror had once hung. After sunset, the room fell into a deep silence. But around midnight Lena heard strange sounds. They sounded like breathing, quiet and even. She looked around and froze. From the wall where the crack was, a soft scratching sound came, as if someone was scratching her from the other side. Lena moved closer, but immediately stopped, because she felt a cold breath that passed over her skin. "Who's there?" she whispered, although she knew it was pointless. There was no answer, only silence. She grabbed the phone and turned on the flashlight, directing the beam at the crack. The light showed something shiny, like glass. Lena leaned closer and realized that it was a shard of mirror, embedded in the wall. Her heart pounded harder. She touched the crack with her fingers, and then the light went out. The room became so dark that it seemed as if the walls were absorbing any sound. "You see me?" A rustling sounded nearby. Lena turned around and almost screamed. In the darkness, she saw a reflection, but not her own. It was a face that looked like her own, but with empty, black eyes and a smile that stretched almost to her ears. "Why did you come?" A voice came from everywhere, resonating in her head. "This is not the place for you." The reflection began to approach, breaking out of the wall. Lena tried to run, but her legs would not obey. She felt something invisible pulling her towards the crack. "Turn the mirrors around," the creature whispered. "Take us home." With her last strength, Lena freed her hand and slammed the phone against the wall. The glass of the mirror inside shattered into 1,000 fragments, and the creature's scream tore the air. She fainted. When Lena came to, the room was already light, and Mr. Gray stood above her with an impassive face. "You shouldn't have touched the crack," he said. "Now they know you're here." "Who is they?" Lena whispered. Gray didn't answer, but when she looked at her reflection in the window pane, she saw that the black eyes no longer belonged to the person standing in the room. They belonged to her. Lena gasped, staring at her distorted reflection in the window. She stepped back, but tripped over the corner of the bed and fell. What happened to me? She screamed, clutching her face. It's not you, mister, Gray said coldly, leaning toward her. It's them, using you as a new portal. His words were drowned out by her panic. The hands she used to touch her face now felt far and the skin was cold, and the nails were longer, sharper, almost claws. What have you done to me? She said, standing up, trying to stay away from Mr. Gray. He just sighed. I warned you. The hotel is not just a place. It's a prison for those held by mirrors. Every piece of glass is a gate. Every shard is a key. And you just let them out. Lena couldn't believe it. She looked around, searching for a way out. But the corridor beyond the hotel door was no longer the same as she had come. The walls gleamed with dark, dull glass. And in every fragment she could see them, distorted figures, pushing closer to the surface. You must choose, mister, Gray said, his voice deeper, more distant. Either they will take you, or you will become their guide. No. Lena screamed. I will not be part of this horror. Gray smiled, and his eyes suddenly shone with the same black light as her reflection. Then you will have to fight them. Lena felt the cracks begin to appear again throughout the hotel. They spread through the walls, the floor, even there. Each crack opened a new portal, and those in the mirrors crawled out. Blurred figures with elongated faces and empty eyes. She remembered the shard of glass she had seen earlier. If it was a key, then perhaps it was a weapon. Grabbing what was left of her phone, Lena slammed it into the nearest crack. The mirror shattered into tiny shards, and the creature emerging from it disappeared with a terrible scream. Destroy the mirror, she muttered, realizing that the only way to escape was to destroy all the portals. But the hotel was changing with every moment. The walls were contracting, the corridors were twisting, as if the hotel were alive and trying to keep her inside. This won't work, mister. Gray's voice echoed from all sides. They've already merged with you. Lena screamed in pain, feeling something penetrate her mind. Her thoughts blurred, and reality turned into a chaotic mosaic. Hold on, someone whispered, and she suddenly saw a shadow in front of her. Not at all like the creatures from the mirrors. It was the figure of a woman, covered in a radiant white light. They will not be able to absorb you if you find the central mirror. It controls everything. Lena rushed forward, feeling each step becoming more difficult. But she knew that she had to find this mirror before darkness and fear finally took hold of her. Jeremy froze, unable to look away from the twisted face in the mirror. The woman, who didn't move but somehow made him hear her voice, seemed to be from another world. Her empty eyes absorbed the light, leaving only darkness. Did you think you could find the truth? She asked, her voice coming again. But this time it was louder, as if it were breaking out of all the mirrors around her. Jeremy looked around. The mirrors in the basement, which had previously seemed simply old and dusty, now sparkled. Their surfaces shimmered, and figures came to life in their reflections. Hundreds of eyes stared at him, their empty gazes piercing into his very soul. Who are you? What does this all mean? Jeremy tried to scream, but his voice trembled. We are the ones bound in glass, the woman answered, and her figure in the mirror began to change. The face grew uglier, the voice louder. Mirrors are not just reflections, they are doors. We see you as you see us. He backed away until his back was against the wall. Suddenly the basement door began to shake, as if someone was trying to force it open. Help! Jeremy shouted, but there was no answer. The reflections in the mirrors began to emerge from their frames. They stretched out like shadows, materializing in the darkness of the basement. You came here alone. You are one of us now, the woman said, her twisted body almost reaching him. Jeremy realized he had no choice. He remembered a legend he had heard from an old man in the bar. The only thing that can stop a mirror is to break it. He grabbed a heavy piece of wood lying nearby and hit the nearest mirror with all his strength. It shattered into hundreds of pieces, but instead of releasing the reflection, a piercing scream filled the room. No! The woman screamed, her body beginning to fall apart. but the basement itself was falling apart with her. The walls shook, shards of glass flew like knives, and the door suddenly flew open. Jeremy rushed to the exit, ignoring the sharp cuts the shards left. When he ran upstairs, the hotel seemed completely different. The hallways had changed, the walls were covered in mirror cracks, and every window now reflected the same eerie figures. He ran outside, gasping for breath and clutching his cut hand. Looking back at the hotel, he saw the darkness engulfing him, and in place of the main window, the image of a woman appeared, smiling that terrible smile again. "You didn't get rid of us. You just let us out into the world." Her voice rang out in his head. Jeremy realized this was just the beginning. Jeremy stood on the threshold of the hotel, clutching his bleeding hand, watching the building gradually disappear into the thick fog. The darkness seemed alive, absorbing the light of the moon that still hung over the city. "This is not the end," he whispered to himself, trying to control his panic. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft laugh that came from the depths of the fog. At first it seemed distant, but quickly became closer, as if someone was watching him from all sides. "You opened the door, Jeremy," a familiar voice said. It was the voice of the woman in the mirror. "We are free now." He turned, looking for the source of the sound, but all he saw was an empty road. But the laughter did not stop. It echoed from everywhere, turning into something worse, crying, moaning, the whispering of dozens of voices. "No, I didn't want this," Jeremy shouted, but there was no answer. Suddenly moonlight cut through the fog, and a figure appeared on the road. It was Mr. Grey. His black coat fluttered in the sudden gust of wind, his face calm and cold. "You didn't listen to the warnings," he said, his voice quiet. But there was an extraordinary power in it. Mirrors have always been a prison. They held those who were not supposed to enter our world. "I didn't know," Jeremy began, but Grey interrupted him. "Did you think you were playing a game? Now you are a part of it." "Mer." Grey raised his hand, and something black, like liquid smoke, flowed from his palm. This dark glow began to wrap itself around Jeremy, squeezing him like a snake. "What are you doing?" he shouted, trying to break free. "You opened the door, Jeremy. Now you're going to lock it," Grey said. His eyes turned as black as the reflections in the mirrors. The darkness engulfed Jeremy completely, and his scream froze in the air. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in the basement. But this time the mirrors were not dusty, they were perfectly clean, and each one showed his own reflection. But they weren't him. Each of those looking at him from the glass had the same distorted smile he had seen on the woman. "You're the guard now," Grey's voice rang out, echoing from all sides. "The prison needs a guard." Jeremy realized he wouldn't be able to get out. His life had ended here, in the basement, among the mirrors that had now become his prison. Meanwhile, the Moonlit Night Hotel continued to stand on the outskirts of the city, waiting for new guests who would not be able to contain their curiosity. The Moonlit Night Hotel stood still, like a forgotten ruin of time. But its silence was deceptive. In the dark depths of the basement, among the mirrors, a new guard watched the world through the fragments of reality. Jeremy, now a shadow of his former self, sat in the center of the room, surrounded by mirrors. His face seemed normal, but in the reflections it was different, twisted, with empty eyes, smiling that eerie smile. "Time is running out," whispered one of the reflections in the mirror. "Guests will come." Jeremy wanted to scream, but his voice disappeared into the void. He felt his thoughts gradually dissolve, merging with the reflections that were now his only company. On the outskirts of town, a truck driver pulled up outside the hotel. His headlights illuminated the Moonlit Night sign, and he sighed. The night was long, and the journey even longer. "Maybe they'll at least serve coffee here," he muttered, turning off the engine. The man entered the lobby, where the atmosphere was strange. Dust covered the old furniture and the air was thick with mustiness. Grey sat at the reception desk, his dark eyes shining in the dim light. "Welcome to the Moonlight Night," he said with a faint smile. "Do you want to stay the night?" The driver shrugged. Just for a few hours. Then we'll be on our way again. Gray nodded and handed over the key with the number 7 on it. The room is ready. I hope you'll be comfortable. The man ignored the fact that there were no mirrors in the lobby. It didn't matter to him. But as soon as he climbed to the second floor and entered his room, something immediately felt wrong. The darkness in the room was thick, even when he turned on the light. The curtains on the windows barely let in the moonlight. But the worst thing was the mirror-like shine of the window glass. He came closer and saw his reflection, but it didn't move as it should. When he tilted his head, the reflection remained motionless. What the hell? He muttered, but then his own face in the window began to change. The eyes disappeared. His mouth stretched into a terrible smile. He stepped back, gasping, but at that moment the door closed behind him. Dark laughter echoed through the room. "A new guest," came a whisper. "You will become one of us." The man rushed to the door, but it would not open. The reflection in the window approached, as if the glass were no longer a barrier. Suddenly it reached out a hand that broke through the glass. "No!" the man shouted, but that was only the beginning. Gray sat in the foyer, staring at the old clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock, the sound cut through the silence. A faint smile appeared on his face. Somewhere down in the basement, Jeremy heard another scream. He knew another soul had fallen into the mirrors, and the Moonlit Night Hotel continued to wait for its next guests, each one approaching their fate. The Moonlit Night Hotel eventually fell back into its usual silence, like a predator temporarily calmed after a hunt. Gray finished his entry in the old registration book, leaving the driver's name there. The letters engraved in ink seemed to vibrate on the paper, their shadow casting something more than just light. The basement of the hotel remained in oppressive darkness. Jeremy, now completely absorbed by the mirror reality, felt a new soul join the prison. A new reflection appeared in the mirrors. The truck driver, frozen in a state of horror, with trembling hands and empty eyes. "You get used to it," a voice said. It was one of the mirrors, or rather, a soul that had long since lost its own face. "It happens to everyone." Jeremy tried not to listen. He knew that resistance was futile, but there was still a part of his mind that still fought for freedom. "Do you think you can find a way out?" the voice continued. "But it's just an illusion. We're here forever." Jeremy glanced at the broken mirrors he had broken that fateful day. Their reflections looked strange, as if some force that distorted reality was still acting on them. "Reflections are doors," he repeated to himself, remembering the woman's words. "But maybe they can be used the other way around." His thoughts were interrupted by a sound from above. Another guest. Will he be the next victim? A young writer named Adam, who had been traveling the cities in search of inspiration, found himself in front of a hotel. He was drawn not only by the mysterious sign, but also by the unusual history of the place, which he had heard in a local cafe. "They say this hotel is cursed," the waitress told him. "But you're a writer. You're interested in that, right?" Adam smiled, taking her words as a joke, and headed for the Moonlit Night. In the lobby, he saw a gloomy man in a dark coat. Gray greeted him with the traditional phrase, "Welcome. Do you need a room?" "Yes, just for one night," Adam replied, not realizing that this night could be the last of his life. When he entered the room, he immediately felt a coldness that could not be explained. Everything was strangely familiar, as if he had been here before. But the writer decided to leave these thoughts and get down to his notes. He did not know that the basement came alive when a new guest crossed the threshold. Jeremy felt his presence, as all the other souls in the mirrors felt. "The new one has arrived," a voice called from the basement. "I can't let this go on," Jeremy thought. "I have to find a way to stop this." He began to examine the mirrors, searching for any sign that might give him a clue. But they only mocked him, reflecting his own fears. Meanwhile, Adam began to experience strange phenomena. The writing in his notebook changed on its own, forming the words, "Help us. Mirrors lie." Confused, he jumped to his feet and walked to the window. His own reflection looked back at him with a twisted smile. "What's going on here?" he exclaimed. The reflection suddenly spoke. "Kill Gray, and you can escape. But hurry, before he knows you're seeing it." Adam felt trapped. What kind of place was this? And can you trust what your own reflection says? Adam stood by the window, clutching a notebook, where strange words continued to appear. He's watching. The mirrors are the key. Destroy them before it's too late. His heart was pounding. Was this a trap? Could he trust what he was seeing and reading? But his gut told him it was dangerous to stand still. He turned around, searching for some explanation. But the room seemed even more hostile. The shadows on the walls moved as if trying to grab him. "Well, if the mirrors are the key, we'll start with them," Adam whispered, trying to control his fear. He opened the door and cautiously stepped out into the hallway. The darkness that reigned in the hotel seemed almost tangible. Somewhere deep down, soft whispers were heard that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. In the basement, Jeremy sensed something new. It was as if a glimmer of hope had pierced the oppressive darkness of his prison. "Someone is trying to fight," he whispered. "It's futile," said a voice from the mirror next to him. "This guest will become part of the collection, like all the others." "No, this time it will be different," Jeremy replied, filled with sudden confidence. He focused on his own reflection, trying to summon whatever power the mirrors might have. His consciousness reached out to Adam, like a thin beam of light piercing through the darkness. Adam descended to the first floor, his gaze falling on the antique chandelier, which gleamed dimly in the moonlight. There was no one at the reception desk, but he felt that he was being watched. "If we destroy the mirrors," he began, but his thoughts were cut off by the creak of a door behind him. He turned and saw Mr. Gray. He stood still, his dark silhouette almost invisible in the semi-darkness. "Are you looking for something, Mr. Adam?" Gray asked, his voice both polite and threatening. "Just looking around," Adam replied, trying not to show his fear. Gray nodded and slowly approached. "You've probably heard stories about this place. Something like that. But they're just legends, right?" "Oh, legends always have a grain of truth in them," Gray said, his smile widening. Adam realized that time was running out. He had to act. "Where are all the mirrors, by the way?" he asked, trying to gather information. Gray tilted his head, his eyes glinting like a predator's. "They're where they belong," he replied. "Now, wouldn't you like to go back to your room?" Adam nodded, but instead of climbing the stairs, he dashed toward the basement. His body moved almost automatically, as if something or someone was guiding him. "Stop!" Gray's voice cut through the air, but Adam had already opened the door and disappeared into the darkness of the basement. Once inside, he felt as if he was surrounded by shadows with lives of their own. Mirrors glittered all around him, their surfaces reflecting something Adam couldn't understand. "Destroy the mirrors," a voice said. Adam stopped. "Who are you?" "Jeremy," the voice replied. "If you break them, we can all escape." "And what about Gray?" "He'll lose his strength, but you need to hurry. He's already following you." Adam looked around, seeing the shadows on the walls begin to move faster. His heart was pounding, but he mustered his strength. Picking up a piece of metal, he swung it and hit the first mirror. The glass cracked, and a scream escaped from it, like a soul trying to break free. Adam continued, breaking mirror after mirror until the room was filled with a storm of whispers, moans, and cries. Gray appeared behind him. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. Adam turned, clutching the piece in his hands. "This place will no longer be yours." Gray took a step toward it, but the darkness around him suddenly began to consume him. The remaining mirrors now turned their power against him. "No!" Gray shouted, disappearing into the darkness that had once been his weapon. When it was all over, Adam emerged from the basement, his body shaking, but he felt a sense of relief. The hotel was silent, the mirrors no longer a trap. Jeremy and the other souls had escaped, leaving the place forever. But at the end of the corridor, Adam saw a shadow that remained. It was Gray, now only a faint reflection of himself. "I'll be back," he whispered before finally disappearing. Adam left the hotel knowing that he had survived more than just a terrible night. But he also realized that the evil that lived here might not be completely gone. Adam had left Moonlight Night, but he could feel the shadow of the place haunting him even in the bright sunlight. His fingers clutched the notebook, which still bore traces of those strange words that seemed to have been written by someone other than himself. This place will no longer be a threat, he whispered to himself, trying to convince himself that it was over. And yet, as he got into his old car and drove away, a figure flashed in the rearview mirror, one that looked like Mr. Gray. It only appeared for a moment, but it was enough to make Adam's heart sink. "It's all good. It's all in the past," he repeated, concentrating on the road. Days passed, but peace did not come. When Adam tried to sleep, he had nightmares. Mirrors whispering his name, and Gray's face appearing in the darkness. He began to notice strange things even in his apartment. The reflections in the windows seemed distorted, and the bathroom mirror would sometimes flicker with figures that weren't supposed to be there. One evening, sitting at his desk, Adam decided to write about his experience. He thought it would help him cope with his fear. "Maybe if I tell this story, it will lose its power," he told himself. But as soon as he started writing, something strange happened. The words began to appear on their own, just like they did in Moonlit Night. "He's alive. He's here. Get ready to come back." Adam jumped, throwing his notebook aside. His heart was pounding. He rushed to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and looked up at the mirror. Gray was standing there. "I warned you," Gray said in an ominous voice. "You destroyed my home, but now I've found a new one." "No, that's impossible," Adam shouted, flinching. Gray just smiled. "Every mirror is a portal, my friend. And you left me free." The reflection suddenly darkened, and darkness began to seep through the glass. Like a thick shadow seeping into the real world, Adam grabbed a towel and closed the mirror, trying to stop what was happening. But the shadow was already beyond the glass, wrapping around his room, absorbing the light. Gray didn't disappear, he was just waiting. His spirit was now bound to the mirrors, and anyone who looked into the reflection became his next target. Adam realized this too late. His scream dissolved in the darkness that enveloped the room. The next morning, the neighbors found the apartment empty, but the mirrors inside were broken. Yet, one piece of glass remained intact. In it, if you looked closely, you could see the smiling face of Mr. Gray, patiently waiting for his next guest. The city woke up, but for Adam, a new day had not yet dawned. His disappearance became a mystery to the police, but the case was quickly closed, considering him missing. However, neighbors began to notice strange things, shadows flickering in the windows of his apartment, and sounds similar to whispers when no one was supposed to be inside. The piece of the mirror that remained intact fell into the hands of the new owner of the apartment, who decided to keep it as an antique. But, as expected, this story was far from over. The new resident of the apartment was a young photographer named Luke, who was looking for inspiration for his work. He loved old things, so the mirror fragment became the perfect accent in his studio. Luke did not know where this mirror came from, but it looked very unusual. The surface had a barely noticeable shade of dull blue. In the first nights after moving, he began to have strange dreams. In them, he wandered through corridors that resembled a hotel. The mirrors in these corridors glowed with a pale light, and from each of them came someone's whisper. One day he woke up in the middle of the night, and heard something scratching the surface of a mirror fragment. Luke approached it, picked it up, and saw that thin scratches appeared on the glass, resembling letters. They formed the words, "He's coming back." The next day, Luke decided to hold a photo shoot using the mirror fragment. He took several pictures, but during the editing he noticed something strange. There was always another figure in the reflection of the mirror. Tall, with long arms and empty eyes, she stood in the background. Although Luke was sure that there was no one else in the studio. It's just an optical illusion, Luke tried to reassure himself. But the situation worsened every day. The reflection began to change. Rooms appeared in the mirror that Luke had never seen before. And sometimes it seemed to him that the mirror itself was changing position, turning as if someone was looking through it. Last night, he heard a voice. "You woke me up," said the one who was in the mirror. Luke wanted to run away, but the darkness in the room became thick, as if alive. The mirror fragment suddenly shone with a bright light, and in its depths Luke saw the Moonlight Hotel. "Your home is here now," the mirror said, and Luke felt something pulling him inside. He screamed, but the mirror swallowed him, leaving only a quiet whisper in the empty apartment. A few months later, the mirror fragment was found again. The new owner noticed it at a flea market and decided to buy it. The story continued. The mirror always found its next owner, and Mr. Gray, now even stronger, patiently waited for new souls to add to his collection. A few weeks after Adam's disappearance, news of the Moonlit Night began to spread faster than ever. The hotel no longer seemed abandoned. The curiosity of locals and adventurers increased, after rumors of eerie events associated with it. One of these desperate people, a young woman named Elizabeth, having heard stories of missing people and mirrors, decided to solve the mystery of the hotel. She was a freelance journalist who wrote articles about mystical phenomena, and this story could be her big breakthrough. Elizabeth spent several days in libraries, looking for records about Mr. Gray, the previous owners of the hotel, and strange incidents associated with the building. Her discovery was shocking. Mr. Gray was no ordinary man. According to legends, he made a deal with something dark and incomprehensible in order to continue his existence. Mirrors were not simply reflections of the world, but gateways to another reality, where souls were trapped forever. Those who tried to disrupt this system either disappeared or became part of it. With this knowledge, she set off for the hotel, armed with a camera, a recorder, and a simple hammer. When she arrived at the Moonlit Night, the place looked abandoned, but not as described in previous descriptions. The hotel's facade was gloomy, but a light was on in one of the third-floor windows. "This is either a trap, or someone lives here," she whispered to herself. As she entered, Elizabeth felt a coldness pierce her body. It seemed as if the walls themselves were whispering to her of danger. She took out her recorder and turned on the recording. "I am inside the Moonlit Night Hotel." There was silence all around, but the air was heavy, as if something was watching. As she walked down the main hallway, she saw the reception desk. On it lay an old guest book. She turned the pages and found the name Adam Murray. His entry was a few weeks old, but there was something she couldn't explain. A red handprint that looked very fresh. Elizabeth decided to go up to the third floor. The light she had seen outside was now on in a room at the end of the hallway. As she approached, the door suddenly opened slowly on its own. "Is anyone here?" she asked, but there was no answer. She entered the room. Everything looked ordinary except for one thing. A large antique mirror stood in the center of the room. It was perfectly clean, although the rest of the interior was covered in dust. Elizabeth approached the mirror, but she couldn't see her reflection in it. Instead, Gray was staring at her. "Welcome," he said, and the glass suddenly began to tremble. Elizabeth screamed, trying to escape, but the door closed. Gray reached out to her, and the mirror's surface began to emit a black mist. "You are here for a reason," he said. "Your arrival was inevitable." Elizabeth took out a hammer and, without thinking, hit the mirror. The glass shattered into pieces, releasing a scream that could scare even the bravest. When she came to, the mirror was destroyed, and the room was empty. Elizabeth hurried to leave the hotel, but noticed that the mirror fragments remained in her bag, although she had not taken them. At home, she spread the fragments on the table. Each of them contained a reflection of Gray, smiling. "The game has just begun," she read in her notebook, though she didn't write it down. After Elizabeth realized that the mirror fragments remained with her, She felt her world begin to change. All the mirrors in her apartment, even the smallest ones, began to behave strangely. They showed shadows that were not in the room, and barely noticeable reflections that flickered when she walked past. Day 1. Elizabeth decided to photograph the mirror fragments, hoping to find something unusual. But her camera refused to focus on them. She saw only blurred silhouettes in the lens, moving as if they were alive. Day 2. Her sleep became short and disturbing. In her dream, she saw Moonlit Night, a hotel standing in darkness, and Gray's voice, repeating, "Mirrors are more than you think." Day 3. The reflections in the fragments began to change. At first, they were familiar faces: her father, her mother, even her brother, who had died years ago. But when she tried to touch one of the fragments, the face changed, and Gray appeared. "You shouldn't have touched them, Elizabeth," he whispered. She jumped back, her heart pounding. Day 4. The fragments began to disappear. Each time she woke up, there were fewer of them, but other mirrors appeared in the apartment. Small, large, even antique frames that she had never seen before appeared on the walls and furniture. "What's going on?" she asked herself, but there was no answer. The reflections began to follow her. When she passed a mirror, she saw herself in it, but her reflection always lingered, turning its head back to her, even when she had already looked away. Day 5. Elizabeth realized she was no longer alone. In the mirrors, she began to notice other figures standing behind her, even when she was sure there was no one in the room. These figures whispered her name, their voices growing louder. "Take us home. Take us back to the moonlit night." She could no longer ignore it. She decided to return to the hotel, hoping that a solution could stop this horror. Return to the moonlit night. When Elizabeth entered the hotel, the building seemed even more gloomy. She felt a shadow envelop her, as if the place itself welcomed her return. "Gray," she cried. "I'm here. What do you want?" Instead of an answer, the door slammed shut behind her. The mirrors she had seen in her dream now surrounded her on all sides. Each one held Gray's reflection. "You brought me home," he said, his voice echoing in the space. But that's not all. The mirrors began to move, forming a circle around Elizabeth. Her heart was beating wildly. "I won't let you take me," she screamed, pulling out the hammer she had brought with her. She broke one of the mirrors, but instead of shards, a black mist erupted from it, wrapping itself around her legs as if alive. "Each broken fragment opens a new door," Gray whispered. "You have a choice: to stay here forever, or to bring me new souls." Elizabeth was faced with a choice she could not avoid. Can she break this cycle, or will she become another trap for the next victim? "You said." Elizabeth tried to gather her thoughts, staring at the black mist swirling around her feet. She realized that she had only one tool left in her hands to fight back her own mind and will. "You want new souls," she said, peering into Gray's reflection in another mirror. "But I will not be your servant." Gray's reflection shriveled, as if a crack had formed at her words. "You don't understand," he replied. "It's not a choice. It's an inevitability." The mirrors around her began to tremble. Other people appeared in their reflections, those she had seen in her dreams, even those whose names she had found in an old hotel magazine. They screamed, they begged, their bodies contorted as if they were made of broken glass. Elizabeth remembered that in her research she had found a mention of one way to break the connection between the mirrors and Gray. An old book found in the library said that to destroy the mirror portal, a sacrifice of true intention was required. She took out of her bag the shard of the mirror that had brought her here. The black mist immediately swirled around her more strongly. "What are you doing?" Gray's voice became harsh and angry. Elizabeth pressed the shard to her wrist, realizing what she would have to do. "If you don't want to free the souls, I will do it myself," she shouted and cut her hand, allowing drops of blood to fall onto the shard. The black mist exploded in a wave, and the mirrors began to break one after another. The screams in them grew louder, but they gradually died down, turning into silence. She fell to the floor, feeling her strength drain from her. The last thing she saw was Gray's reflection, warping and crumbling until his face was gone forever. When Elizabeth woke up, she was outside the hotel. The building looked as if it had been abandoned years ago. No lights, no sign of life. All the mirrors that had appeared in her apartment had disappeared. She knew this was the end of the story. But she also understood that the darkness that had been in Moonlit Night could find another place. Elizabeth looked at her cut, which was already beginning to heal. In its place remained a barely noticeable scar, but when she looked at it more closely, it seemed to her that it reflected something she was not yet ready to see. Elizabeth ran her hand over the scar, trying to figure out if it was just a figment of her imagination, or if it really reflected something unusual. She tried to calm herself down and convince herself that it was all over. But inside, an elusive fear remained. Was the darkness really gone forever? A week later, Elizabeth returned to her normal life, but it seemed that her new reality only masked a hidden threat. One evening, while browsing through old books, she came across a letter wedged between the pages of one of the volumes she had borrowed from the city library. The letter was yellowed, with slightly burnt edges, and the ink on it seemed fresh. It read, "Elizabeth, you have opened a door that should have remained closed. You have saved them, but the price for this is only beginning. Find the key, or the scar will become your curse. G." She clutched the letter in her hands, her heart beating faster. Who could have written this? And why now did her scar begin to burn faintly, like hot iron? A night full of shadows. That same night, when she was sleeping, she was awakened again by a strange sound, as if something was tapping on the glass. She turned to the window. There was nothing there. But, turning back, she saw a shadow appear in the mirror above her dresser. "You're back," it whispered, and the sound seemed to come not only from the mirror, but from every corner of her room. Elizabeth broke this mirror, as she had done before. But this time the fragments did not disappear. On the contrary, they rose into the air and began to connect, forming a new mirror, much larger. In its surface she saw herself, but it was not her. The reflection had black eyes and a smile that stretched unnaturally wide. "You are a part of me now," the creature said. "The scar is our connection." Unraveling the scar, Elizabeth realized that her scar was not just a memory of the events of Moonlit Night. It was a seal that bound her to the other side. If she couldn't find a way to break this bond, darkness could settle in her life forever. She decided to return to the library to find more information about the key mentioned in the letter. In the old city archives, she found a mention of a mysterious artifact, a fragment of a mirror that was used to seal evil spirits. But the artifact had long been lost. The last known place where it was seen was in one of the old estates on the outskirts of the city, where strange disappearances of people had occurred. Elizabeth knew that her path would be full of dangers, but she had to find the artifact to finally close the door between the world of mirrors and her own. The next day she set out for the estate, taking with her an old hammer and the shard of the mirror that had saved her last time. The estate stood grimly, like a living being waiting for her. But she was ready to face her fear, for she knew that this was her only chance for salvation. Elizabeth stood in front of a grand but neglected estate. The huge windows were covered with cobwebs, and the doors were firmly closed. There was an oppressive silence around, as if warning, only those who are willing to pay the highest price enter here. She carefully pushed the old door, and it gave way with a loud creak. It was dark inside. Her phone flashlight illuminated only part of the spacious hallway, where old portraits looked at her with empty eyes. "There you are," a familiar voice whispered. Elizabeth instantly turned around, but saw no one. Only a barely noticeable shadow slid along the wall, disappearing into the darkness. Old diary moving further. She found a room with scattered books and papers. Amid the chaos lay a diary with a hard leather cover. Opening it, Elizabeth saw an old note. "The artifact is kept in the Hall of Mirrors, but be careful. Anyone who approaches it will never leave again. She went cold. The Hall of Mirrors. She already knew that mirrors in this world were not just reflections. They were portals that hid something much more terrible. The path to the Hall of Mirrors. Elizabeth climbed the spiral staircase that led to the second floor. With each step, the shadows became thicker, and the sounds of her footsteps seemed too loud. She felt that she was not alone. Broken mirrors hung on the walls of the second floor. Their fragments seemed alive, and as she passed by, they changed their reflections. They showed her childhood, past fears, and then her own face with empty black eyes. "It's just an illusion," she whispered, trying not to look. Finally, she reached a large double door carved from dark wood. Above it hung an inscription: "The Hall of Mirrors. Enter only with a sincere heart." Encountering the truth opening the door, she found herself in a room where the walls were completely covered with mirrors. Their surface shone like water, and each of them showed a different scene. Sometimes the past, sometimes the future, sometimes something that was difficult to explain. In the center of the room stood an artifact, a fragment of a huge mirror, set in a metal frame. A black mist swirled around it. "Finally," said a voice that echoed loudly in each mirror, "you have come to give yourself." "Never," Elizabeth answered, approaching the artifact. The black mist began to take shape. A familiar silhouette appeared before her, Gray. But now he looked like a living nightmare. His body was made of mirror fragments, and his eyes burned with an eerie light. "The artifact belongs to me," he said. "Do you think you can stop me?" Elizabeth raised her mirror fragments that she had brought with her. She remembered the words from an old book: "Only a true reflection can destroy a mirror shadow." She pointed the fragment at Gray, and he screamed, his body beginning to crack. "You haven't won yet." His voice trailed off, and then it exploded into thousands of tiny glass particles that disappeared into the air. The last riddle. Elizabeth walked up to the artifact and touched it. At that moment, the hall was filled with light, and all the mirrors began to shatter, leaving only the bare walls. When she opened her eyes, the Hall of Mirrors was empty. The artifact had crumbled to dust, and her scar had disappeared. Elizabeth knew she had completed her mission, but she also understood that mirrors never completely disappeared. They were just waiting for a new reflection, a new guest to show them the way. Elizabeth returned to the city, feeling the weight of the past gradually leaving her. She was sure that she had put an end to the horrors of the Hall of Mirrors, but something deep inside whispered to her that this was only the beginning. One evening, as she was getting ready to sleep, her gaze fell on the new mirror she had just bought for her apartment. Her room was reflected on its surface, but something was wrong. In the reflection appeared a light that was not there in reality, and a barely visible silhouette. She came closer, but saw nothing. Only her own face, which seemed to be looking at her a little differently than usual. "It's just fatigue," she whispered to herself, turning off the light. But as soon as she lay down in bed, she heard a soft tapping on the mirror in the darkness.